Okay, so last class we learned about the law of the sea. We spoke about the history of the law of the sea, how the law of the sea developed or it got evolved over the years, how it grew over the years. We also spoke about Hugo Grotius, who is called as a father of international law, and we spoke about how nations were actually living freely because water is a free resource. But later on, there were certain squabbles and disputes, which turned eventually into disputes between the nations and different countries. And that's how, bit by bit, the law of the seas developed. And today we have got a codified, codified law of the sea, and we've got this international conventions. I gave you introduction of those conventions, the two basic conventions on the international law of the sea. And in today's class, we are going to learn about maritime areas or general maritime areas. What are the demarcations of the world's waters? How we have internal waters, how there is a demarcation, how there are territorial boundaries, and how what are those regions called beyond the territorial sea, the high sea, the contiguous zones, and so on. And how as you know, in international law for countries, we refer them to states. So how the state parties, or how these countries exercise the right over their own territorial waters, internal waters, and how they can even have access to the high seas, and what are those exceptions, or what are those exceptions, and the extent to which the countries can enjoy the high seas. So that is what we are going to learn in today's class. So without wasting much of time, we'll directly go to our slides now. So maritime areas and right of innocent passage. So in this class, we're also going to touch upon the aspect of innocent passage, or learn about what is this right of innocent passage. Now, first we will just mute your mic, please. Thank you. Now, okay, there's a student who's entering the class now. Just mute your mic, please.
Yes,
Can you see
can
the screen? Yes, good. Okay, so now first of all, we are going to learn about the general maritime areas. We are going to learn about the different maritime areas. We are going to learn about what are those definitions there. So first thing is internal waters. So what are the internal waters? Now, internal waters are waters over which the state or any country exercises complete sovereignty, just as we discussed in the last chapter. What it is, that means it has got complete sovereignty, complete right over the internal waters, the waters that are within the boundaries of any country. That particular nation, that particular country has got right over this waters. So what are the example of internal waters? You got these rivers, lakes, the portion of the sea which is within the state. All these are internal waters. So let me tell you, just for your knowledge, the largest maritime area in the world belongs to Europe, or rather I should say that Europe has got the largest maritime area, and in Europe, France holds a major share of waters. Okay, so now coming back to the definitions and the types of, or the different demarcations that we have with respect to maritime areas. One is internal waters, that is the waters which is within the state or a nation or a country, upon which that particular nation or country exercises complete sovereignty, is called as internal waters, or could be defined as internal waters. Next is the territorial sea. Now, what is the territorial sea? Territorial sea is that portion of the ocean where the state exercises sovereignty, but there exists a right of innocent passage for foreign vessels, that is, foreign ships, without harming the rights of the state over the territorial sea. So the territorial sea extends up to 12 nautical miles from the baseline's low water mark. What is a baseline? The lowest water mark. From the baseline, 12 nautical miles would be considered as a territorial sea. So again, what is the territorial sea, or what is defined? How could you define territorial sea? Territorial sea is that portion of the ocean where the state exercises sovereignty, but there exists a right to innocent passage. For whom? For foreign vessels or for ships, foreign ships which do not belong to that particular country, but without harming the rights of the nation to whom the territorial sea belongs, or of that particular state over to whom the particular territorial sea belongs. So the measurements are, of course, the territorial sea extends up to 12 nautical miles from the baseline, that is the low water mark. Next is the contiguous zones. Contiguous zones are zones that measure from the end of 12 nautical miles of the territorial sea up to the 24 nautical miles, it is 44 kilometers approx, thus forming a contiguous zone. So it's, for example, canals, straits. So these kind of areas would be considered as contiguous zones. So again, what are those contiguous zones? Zones that measure from the end of the 12 nautical miles of the territorial sea up to the 24 nautical miles, that is of approximately 44 kilometers, and these form contiguous zone. For example, canals and straits. Next is international straits. So the Commander's Handbook on the Law of Naval Operations, NWP 9, has defined a strait and conveyed that straits are used. So you can see the picture there, that's how straits look like. So straits are used for international navigation between one part of the high sea or an exclusive economic zone and another part of the high sea or an exclusive economic zone. So the definition is basically derived from the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, under Articles 37 and 38 of this particular convention. So the Free Dictionary defines international straits as an outlet from enclosed seas to the high seas that have a special legal status. So basically, the rules of navigation in such straits are regulated by special international agreements that in many cases contain restrictions on entry into enclosed seas by warships of countries without coastlines on those seas. So thereby, the two factors that come to the fore, about straits are: one is the ability to connect water bodies, and two is the use of the straits for navigation. So these are the two predominant features of the straits. That is, one is their ability to connect water bodies, and two is the use of these straits for navigation. So therefore, straits operate as international transit passages as well. So for example, you got the Strait of Gibraltar, you got Turkish Straits and Russia, and so on. Now, what are exclusive economic zones? So exclusive economic zones could also be called as maritime continental margin. So the United Nations Convention of the Sea 1982 defined the EEZ, or the exclusive economic zone, as an area of the sea in which a sovereign state has special rights regarding the exploration and use of marine resources, including energy production from water and wind, and it stretches from the outer limit of the territorial sea, that is 12 nautical miles from the baseline, out of 200 nautical miles from the coast of the state in question. So EEZ, as you also call it, exclusive economic zone, EEZ, is an area therefore adjacent to the territorial sea, extending up to 200 nautical miles, that is approximately 370 kilometers, out from its coastal baseline. So thereby, the contiguous zones may come within the ambit or within the EEZ as well. So it may even encompass artificial islands at times. So the states have jurisdiction over the resources of the area under the EEZ, and it is used for exploitation, extraction, conservation, and tapping of all sorts of living and non-living resources, fishing, and so on. tapping sea minerals, oil and gas, and some other allied resources. I remember last class we studied this particular picture, what you can see here. Now, this, if you see here, so this is the baseline, okay? Now, from the baseline of a state, of a particular state waters, from the baseline, 12 nautical miles is the territorial sea. From the baseline, 24 nautical miles would be considered as the contiguous zone. So within the contiguous zone comes the territorial sea. Now, beyond, that is, after the contiguous zone, extends the area of the exclusive economic zone. Do you see that? So after the economic zone comes the high seas. Now, what is continental shelf, also called as ocean floor? So this is an area that lies towards the edge of the continent in the water, where much of the exploring and exploitation of resources take place. The continental margin comprises three components, that is continental rise, continental slope, and continental shelf. So in this area called the continental shelf, most of the tapping, extraction of resources takes place. Now, it is that portion of a continent that is submerged under an area of relatively shallow water known as the shelf sea. Next, we have the high seas and the most interesting part of this subject. I do not know. It depends upon student to student. But for me, in this subject, the best part that I like is the best chapter, or the best part for me for the law of the sea that I love is, of course, is the high seas. Now, high seas, why? Because they are those wide oceans, the wide seas upon which no state exercises jurisdiction. They're just free waters. Everyone can, use those waters, or ply the ships, or the ships move. The foreign vessels just move over those waters. They're the high seas. They are classified as areas beyond national jurisdiction, that is beyond the sovereignty of any one particular state. It belongs to everyone. So it forms an extraterritorial space beyond the territorial sea and the state jurisdiction. So waters beyond the territorial seas are international waters, or the high sea, over which every nation or state can freely use. As Grotius said, that is Hugo Grotius we are talking about, advised that the sea is no man's property and can be freely used by anyone and everyone as a natural resource. Now, when we're talking about the seas being natural resource, now obviously the question that will pop up into your mind is, we call it a natural resource, then why are we talking about the demarcations? That is because states, as we learned about this in the previous class, again, reiterating it again. So there were certain squabbles which eventually turn into disputes, and nations or countries or states started fighting each other, trying to exercise their power over these waters. So that's how the international law of the sea developed.